All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, and we're quite delighted to have with us this evening Shaun Casey, here to talk about his new book, Chasing the Devil at Foggy Bottom, The Future of Religion in American Diplomacy. As a scholar of religion, Shaun has quite an impressive list of academic credentials. He's taught at Harvard Divinity School, Wesley Theological Seminary, and the Walsh School of Foreign Service, and he's directed the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. But Shaun also has had a passion for foreign policy, and over the years he's sought to bridge these two worlds. In fact, it was his desire to engage religion as an effective tool in foreign policy that brought Shaun into government a decade ago as the founding director of the State Department's Office of Religion and Global Affairs, a position he held in the Obama administration from 2013 to 2017. The need for an office that analyzes the role of religion in the world of diplomacy and seeks to forge connections with religious leaders around the world would seem pretty obvious, especially in a time marked by such vexing challenges as Western involvement in the Muslim world, the Sunni-Shia split, and religious extremism. In Chasing the Devil at Foggy Bottom, Shaun tells the story of his stint at the State Department under then-Secretary John Kerry, who was the one who brought Shaun into the department. Shaun notes at the outset of his book that there is a deep disagreement over whether U.S. diplomats should actually spend any time and energy understanding religion around the world. He argues that they should, because religious figures and religious communities are major actors around the world, and ignorance of religion can be pretty costly. As a case in point, just look at the disaster caused by America's misunderstanding of the religious dynamics in Iraq after we invaded. For U.S. diplomacy to be more effective, Shaun maintains, our diplomats need a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of religion, and his book makes a very strong case for that. Now, someone else who's thought long and hard about the role of faith in public life is Mike McCurry, who will be in conversation with Shaun this evening. Mike, of course, is an accomplished communications expert, best known for his time as a White House press secretary to President Clinton, and before that, State Department spokesman. But Mike has also been active in the United Methodist Church, and a decade ago graduated from the Wesley Theological Seminary, where he stayed on to teach about religion and politics. And it was also Mike who introduced Shaun to John Kerry, and if that hadn't happened, you wouldn't even have tonight's book. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Shaun Casey and Mike McCurry.
Well, thank you, Brad, for that, and welcome to everybody. And good to be with all of you. And so I've got to turn it on. There we go. So welcome everybody. It's good to see all of you here. And Brad did such a good job of kind of laying it out. So my first question to you is, why did you write this book? Of all the things that you were doing, why write a book about these experiences that you had?
Well, I'll try to keep my answer under 4 hours to that question. But it's great to be here, and thanks to Mike, to Brad, and I see a lot of very familiar faces here, a lot of folks from the family and from the office itself. So let me just say again, thank you for coming. I guess the first answer to that question is I think it's a great story. That if you go back to 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, suddenly this town was alive with people arguing, we should know something about religious dynamics around the world, because if we don't, we're going to make mistakes. And that discussion heated up then. Then, of course, after 9/11, the same thing happened. But in 2006, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright wrote a book called The Mighty and the Almighty, where she made the case that she didn't have any kind of expertise in terms of advisors to help explain religion as she was seeing it wherever she traveled in the second Clinton term. And then John Kerry comes along, and he'd been on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 40 years. And he had come up with the intuition that American diplomacy had failed many times because it didn't have that capacity, and we could do better. And it was then his action in starting the office and inviting me to come in where we jumped into that stream that had been flowing since 1979, where people in this town had argued back and forth, should we do it, should we not? And if we do engage with religious dynamics around the world, how should we do it? And the how question was really what drew me into this, not the why question. And so we built, for the first time in American history, an office of 30, 35 people who traveled the world, and we tried to show that engaging religious actors and understanding religious dynamics meant we could have a stronger foreign policy. And over the next 4 years, I think we demonstrated that all across the world and with the very smart team of people we put together. I think the second reason to write this book was that in the blink of an eye, it all went away. After the Obama terms were over, we got a president who no longer needed our services, and the office was shut down. The position I had no longer existed. And I think we continued to demonstrate what's the third answer, and that is that misunderstanding or avoiding religion leads to disasters. And I think in my lifetime, the Iraq War was the classic case where in the lead up to the war and then the actual execution of the war, there were multiple stops where our willful ignorance of the lived religious dynamics in Iraq cascaded the errors we made in our policy there, and we spent $7-8 trillion as a result of that. So we made a contribution to this decade-long conversation and argument about the nature of American diplomacy with respect to religion, and we built an alternative. And I thought that was a story worth reliving and telling.
Lots to there to unpack, but go back to the beginning of your book, because you write almost autobiographically a little bit about where you came from. Now, a kid from the Boot Hill, and how did you end up at Harvard, and how did you end up, making all these connections? How did you end up at the State Department? So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I think the tiny town where I was born, Kennett, Missouri, is not a traditional breeding ground of people who work on the 7th floor at the State Department. And yet, there were people who looked at my academic background and thought, indeed, I'd come from a family of privilege, and this was sort of the thing that people... And so I have a chapter called Male, Pale, and Not Quite Yale, because, the old line is the State Department is, male, pale, and Yale. But I grew up in this very strict conservative Christian sect, and I make the argument that if you grow up in kind of a hothouse form of religion, now that's not where I am today theologically, lest you have any anxiety about that, but you learn to look at things and see things that otherwise people might miss if they come from a different orientation. So I ended up going to college in godforsaken West Texas, and I apologize for my friends in Abilene who might be watching this, and I'm heading there in a few weeks, by the way. But I had 3 religion professors there who had trained at Harvard Divinity School. Now, that's an oddity, and in the book I try to explain and account for that. But I didn't know as a kid growing up that you could go to a Harvard or Yale or Chicago and study religion. And when I learned that, I said to myself, that's what I want to be when I grow up. So at the age of 22, I made the pilgrimage from West Texas to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and just felt like I had died and gone to heaven, because there were people there who were deeply interested in religion and politics. And you fast forward to that, and I'm one of these people who has a series of very short conversations on airplanes. People say, well, what do you do? I say, well, I live and teach and write about religion and politics, and silence the rest of the trip. But then when I finished my graduate work, I came to Wesley Theological Seminary here in Washington, D.C., and landed in a hotbed of just brilliant faculty and great students. And then I met you when you were on the Board of Governors, and suddenly a cascade of relationships developed.
Part of what you write about is how uncomfortable some of the political people we know are with the whole idea that religion and politics somehow or other connect. Because, normally we say, we shouldn't talk about religion and politics in polite company. But you helped bridge that gap. Now, part of what you did not talk about just now is you've had some political experience in campaigns and trying to bring some of these things into the way in which we on the Democratic side, pardon to anyone on the other side of the political aisle here, but talk a little bit about that. You part of your experience was trying to draw the campaign operations into a better understanding of how faith connects to politics and how you can actually mobilize people around some of that. That's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, by a kind of winding path, I found myself working on the religious outreach staff of the Obama 2008 presidential campaign. And technically, I was the evangelical coordinator. And I often say I was the only one dumb enough to volunteer to take that position. And one day in Chicago at the headquarters, I was complaining about how I had the toughest job in the campaign. And somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Dude." I said, "Yeah." And he introduced himself. He was head of Sportsmen for Obama. And I said, I surrender. I have the second toughest job in the Obama campaign, but you've got a tough one. But, the irony there is, to this day, for instance, the most loyal base in the Democratic Party are African American women voters. And I'm not sure the average Democratic apparatchik understands that. And then that's not to say that all African American women are deeply devout, but one does find a cadre of African American women who are in fact deeply devout in a multitude of ways, who are at the heart of the success of the Democratic Party. So a lot of what we did, and you've done more of this than I have, is to say, if you're going to build a political coalition, you've got to be open to talking to anybody who wants to come inside the tent. You can't take anybody for granted, nor can you define anybody out of that conversation. And I think in 2008, then Senator Obama really did build an inclusive campaign, and he was willing to go pretty much anywhere and talk to anybody. That virus not to do that is still alive and well in today's Democratic Party, unfortunately. But that led then to getting to meet John Kerry. I met him after he had lost the 2004 election, and we come from two completely different symbolic universes. I'm small town, Southern, conservative Protestant in heritage, and that's not John Kerry's legacy. But we hit it off, and one of the things I have grown to love and admire about him, whatever you make of him as a politician, is he has an intellectual curiosity. And if you disagree with him, he's willing to say, "Show me why." And that led to this sort of odd couple decade of where I showed him that as a liberal Northeastern Catholic, he could speak to evangelical enclaves and get a hearing. But then that tipped over into religion and foreign policy, which was one of my other areas of scholarly interest. And that conversation then led to his invitation to join the State Department.
I remember that connection because during the Kerry campaign in 2004, several of us, me included, tried to get him to talk more about his religion, and we got shot down by the apparatchiks in the campaign, as you call them. And then after the campaign, he thought that he really should talk about that or write about that more. And he contacted me, and I said, I'm not the guy to do this, but I know a guy, and it was you. And that's the connection that got made. So, how do you help someone, in the political world? People have got egos, and but how do you help someone get beneath all of that and really write and think and talk about what matters most?
Well, I think back to a statement our mutual friend E.J. Dionne said, that Democrats discovered God in the exit polls of the 2004 election. At the end of the day, candidates want to get more votes than their opponents. So there's a pragmatic argument to be made. In a southern town where I grew up, my instinct was that if a mayoral candidate walked into the Lions Club breakfast and an advisor said, no, they're the 20 guys against the wall there who will never vote for you. And they're the 20 guys over there they'll follow you no matter where. But in the middle here are 40 people who haven't made up their mind. You direct the mayoral candidate to the 40 who have not made up their mind, and it doesn't care who they are. It doesn't matter who they are. That as a candidate, you need to go and talk to the person who has not made up their mind. And the religion virus, the anti-religion virus, causes many candidates today to be reticent about going to those folks in the middle who might be persuadable, because they assume if you're a certain category of religious practitioner, you're never going to vote for me, so I'm not going to waste my time. And I think that's a mistake, particularly in a world where presidential elections, as we've known, can be set by the votes of 40,000 people over 50 states. So if you're really trying to look for the help, so you're trying to persuade people, and it's hard in the Democratic Party many times, that religion is worth engaging, whether it's at the electoral level or whether it's at the foreign policy level. And I've been able to do both of those, frankly.
Let's get to some of the work that you did at the State Department, which is a hard place sometimes bureaucratically to crack, and to take what your perspective was and to inject that into policy making is difficult. But you were there for, some very, very important things in which religion were front and center, and you talk about that in the book. Whether it's Cuba, it's immigration, it's climate change, the things that you write about in the book, all had an element in them that required someone who had some perspective on how religion impacts policy making. So talk about the work that you did.
Well, I think of three places just off the top of my head. You think about Ukraine and Russia, which is still alive today. You think about Ethiopia, and you think about Cuba. I think those are great examples where if you're the ambassador running the embassy there, it's your job to understand and interpret the political dynamics in that country and report it back to Washington so that our foreign policy apparatus can make better policy decisions. I talked to our ambassador, Jeffrey Pyatt, in Ukraine, and I went to Kyiv back after the initial Russian invasion in the Donbass and down in Crimea. And he told me, he said, I've talked to my brother and sister ambassadors here from other countries, and some of them say, well, we don't do religion. And he told me if you're in Kyiv as the Russians are invading and the Orthodox Church is fighting with itself, literally Christians killing Christians, and you've got Jews and Muslims as collateral damage, and you say to yourself, religion doesn't factor into this, you're never going to understand how to know what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. But that's where we had been. Now, Jeffrey Pyatt was brilliant. He understood the local dynamics. He invited us to come in and do a survey of the landscape there so that he could make smarter decisions. And now we find ourselves now with Russia having fully invaded Ukraine, and the same dynamics are being played out. But there's no office in the State Department to update the kinds of analysis we did back in 2014 and 2015. And now there's almost a global battle within the Orthodox Church with different dynamics playing out around the world. There's no conduit to gather that relevant information and get it to our decision makers. We were among the first diplomats.
Stop for a second. Is that correct? I mean, given how important the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church is and what's going on in Ukraine right now, there's nobody in the State Department right now?
There is no organized single office that has the capacity to basically build a landscape. Now, there are different pockets of people around the foreign policy apparatus, but there's no central coordinating information pipeline. As I understand it, I would be happy to be proved wrong. But my understanding is there are individuals sprinkled across the vast security apparatus who know parts, and some people know a lot, but it's not organized in a way that the so-called principles, the national security principles, the president, vice president, the DOD, the Secretary of State, Pentagon, have all of that in one place.
And is that because during the Trump years, the work that you and your office did kind of evaporated? I mean, I think that's pretty clear. But has it not, under Secretary Blinken, been reestablished or some commitment made to do that?
This is one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to remind folks. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. At the end of the Trump administration, the State Department was decimated. In some ways, some places they were below congressionally mandated personnel levels. Our office was gone. Most of our staff were dispersed and left government service. There are some people, foreign service officers and civil servants who are still in the State Department, but they're dispersed around the world. So yes, that was what they discovered when they walked in the door. The National Security Council, which is the coordinating body. I know this is insider baseball, but that's the location where all the information flows so that the White House can make policy decisions. My understanding is there's no connectivity between experts on religion across the vast bureaucracy. There's no connectivity up to the National Security Council. So the president and the vice president, the Secretary of State and others do not have access to the kind of flows of information and analysis about what's going on in the religious communities there.
You talk a little bit about, the real estate of the State Department, which I know well. Is you had a 7th floor office, and that is like, if any of you know the State Department, that is a very important thing, and that was probably a statement by Secretary Kerry that this is something that I'm considering a priority, so that sends a message throughout the building, and that then reverberates a little bit.
And that was very ironic because for those of you who have connections with Wesley Seminary, my particular office was in the sub-basement of, so and there, let me just say this, there was a bit of selflessness. I mean, nobody really cared where you were. Some students got lost on the way down to my office and they're like, what did you do? But I remember the day when you first get into the State Department, you're put in like holding offices. It's transition, they call it, down on the first floor. And I was down there 3 or 4 weeks, and I had a wastebasket. I had a phone that worked. I had a computer but no printer. So it was just this odd sort of stasis, purgatory, I guess maybe. And the general manager of the building came in and says, come with me, Dr. Casey, you're going to like where I take you. And until that point, I had no idea. And we go up the elevator, and there I am on the 7th floor. I'm between the policy planning office and what ultimately became General Allen's office, the presidential envoy to defeat ISIS. So yes, we landed, and so suddenly, people come into the office and they look out, and there's the window. You can see Arlington Cemetery, and so I had this, I guess PTSD or something, or just the shock that suddenly I had prime real estate, and it does matter. It does matter there.
But talk about the reaction that you got from a lot of the other people in that building. Because it's not natural that many of them think that, who's this religion guy, and what is that all about? Why is there that blind spot in some of the bureaucracy that has to deal with these critical international issues, in which religion plays clearly an important role, but there's just like a blind spot, it seems like, at the State Department.
Well, most of those people never came in and said, it's a mistake that you're here and we hope you go away. A lot of people were curious to say, well, this is interesting, and we read Dr. Albright's book, and those who knew Kerry knew that this was something he cared about. But people got the message. Now, there were some people like, what do you do? And we had a liaison to another office who I will not name, who just like every 6 months he would come back and say, no, okay, run the elevator speech by me again because I still don't get it. But for the most part, people began to see, and I think that the key was we hired people who were collaborators. I knew if we were just a shiny office who would look down our noses and say to anybody who said, why does religion matter? Well, we're the experts, so just leave it to us, we'll take care of it. We would have been kicked out of the building symbolically had we had that kind of arrogant stance. So we built an office, a team of brilliant people who, frankly, I hired people who knew what I didn't know. We didn't need more white male, old Christian theologians. I held that chair. But we had people, if you look at the senior leadership, like the top 5, we had 2 Muslims, we had 2 Jews, and 1 Christian. And that was intentional. And these people, I hired people who knew lived religion in geographical contexts that I had no experience in and no expertise in. And that's how we then built these connectivities to the regional bureaus, which are sort of the Marines, if you will. That's probably an inappropriate statement for our diplomatic corps. But all of our embassies report back to the United States to one of the 6 regional bureaus. Early on, we went to each of those assistant secretaries and said, if you tell us your priorities for your country, I'll come back in 6 weeks with my regional advisor, and we'll build out a set of work goals that will make you successful in your own strategic objectives. So we were going to help them become more successful. So we assumed a posture of collaboration and engagement, not demanding that they come and do whatever we asked them to do. So we were a servant-oriented organization.
But that's kind of like, that sounds like it's smart diplomacy, but what I'm trying to unpack is, why is there resistance to that, do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, nobody got rewarded for it. If you were a foreign service...
It wasn't one of the things that you would get graded on when they do the evaluations.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, you could... Foreign service officers have what they call combs, different specialties, like politics or economics or civil society. But there was never a box saying you were really good at understanding religion in your region. So if you did that... Now, there were staffers who were drawn to that kind of work, but they kind of did it on the side. They did it in their spare time, if you will. But again, that was never a part of their formal evaluation. And so the people who got it came towards us. I didn't have to go and find them. In fact, we ended up with, I think, 17 billets or slots. And we probably had 200 or 300 people come inside the building asking, is there something I can do for you? But the naysayers really were pretty reticent about coming to us and saying, we don't think you belong here.
You write about this in the book, but why don't you, for the audience, talk about some of those times in which you made a real difference, in which there was really, the work that you were doing actually did have an impact on diplomacy and what Secretary Kerry was doing and what the administration was doing.
So I think one of the earliest examples was Secretary Kerry was flying across Europe, and a meeting got canceled like a day or two into this trip. And he called back and said, I want to go meet the Pope's new Secretary of State. Francis had been installed less than a year before. Kerry had never been to the Vatican to meet with the diplomatic apparatus, and there was a new Secretary of State that Francis had just hired. And then I get the message from the Chief of Staff saying, Kerry's going to go to Rome, and he wants you to go help him. And at that point, I had maybe 3 or 4 staffers working for us. So I met Kerry and his entourage in Paris, and overnight I wrote a memo to Kerry saying, here are the themes you need to hit with the Secretary of State to this new Pope. That happened to coincide with the same week where Francis gave his first speech to the Vatican Diplomatic Corps.
Not Laudatum Dei, but it would no.
No, this is just like an annual speech every January.
Right.
And what I showed Kerry on the plane as we were flying from Paris to Rome was that in this speech, Francis sets out his policy priorities looking forward as Pope. And there was climate change, there was the refugee crisis, and then there was basically a Christian-Muslim conflict. And so I was able to show Secretary Kerry that 90% of the Pope's agenda meshed with Secretary Kerry's agenda. And I said, these are the lines of conversation you need to drill down into. And now, the irony struck me. Here's this kid from, conservative Protestantism who's writing a memo to the most recent Catholic Secretary of State, advising him on how to talk to this new Pope, this new papacy. And to this day, John Kerry has a robust relationship with Cardinal Parolin, who is still the Secretary of State there. So he went in, these 2 veterans of foreign policy had this immediate rapport. And Kerry then was able to build on that relationship with respect to Israel, with respect to climate change, on migration and refugee policy in that first meeting, because the little informal dance that inevitably comes when two diplomats meet for the first time was very, very short. They dove into the work. I think the other place where we, I think, made a difference was that David Wade, the chief of staff, put me in contact with Martin Indyk, who was our special envoy to engage in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations.
And former ambassador.
Former ambassador, right. And he has written extensively about the Middle East. And what Martin asked our office to do was to help build relationships with the three faiths, both in the United States but also in the region, because it was his thesis that as negotiations historically had bogged down, that the two negotiating partners would begin to look around, and it was like they were up on the High Wire Act alone and weren't getting civil society support publicly for continuing to go the final few inches to a final agreement. So I went to, we visited Israel several times in Palestine, and I'll never forget my first visit to Jerusalem, and I went to see the Catholic Archbishop. And you walk into his room, and he's got, interestingly, a cadre of like 10 Irish priests advising him, which to this day I still haven't figured out why that was the case. But I walk into the room, and he stands up, he walks across the room, he sticks out his hand, and he says, "Dr. Casey, it is so great to meet you. We've been waiting 40 years for you to show up." So the religious leaders there felt like all the negotiating was going on in the closed rooms, and that their opinions were never factored into at least America's diplomacy. I can't speak for the Palestinian Authority or for the Israeli government. But we then were in a position early on to continue to send people to Jerusalem and to also to the West Bank to talk to the religious communities there. In fact, I see Ira Foreman back here, who was the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Ira and I and Sharik Zuffer, who was the special representative to Muslim communities. Long after the negotiations had effectively ended, we still went back and we visited sites of all three faiths where there had been desecrations of holy sites. We would not have been able to do that had we not gotten into a relationship with Martin Indyk early on.
I want to connect these two thoughts. My experience, I think, like yours, is the impressiveness of the Vatican's foreign service operation. I mean, they are very sophisticated and have got a foreign office that is deeper and more knowledgeable about places in the world. But connect that to what we currently see as the ongoing, never-ending crisis in Israel and Palestine. Could they be playing a bigger role? Is there a way in which we could be encouraging that? And maybe is the work that that you did at the State Department through religion, is that a connecting point that we could actually make a better difference and have a bigger impact in some of what's happening there now?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, in that first conversation Kerry had with Cardinal Parolin, Kerry told them what the current state of the negotiations were from the American perspective. And Parolin knew instantly he was getting insider information from the U.S. Secretary of State because Francis was scheduled to go to Jerusalem about 2 months later. And Netanyahu had sent a briefer to Pope Francis. Abbas had sent a briefer to brief Francis about the state of play. And the one gap in their knowledge in the Vatican was, in fact, the American position. So what that meant was when Pope Francis did go a few months later, he fully understood the political analysis from not only the two parties negotiating, but from America as well. And what that means is the Vatican can be a place where we can learn a lot about what's going on in China, what's going on in Cuba. In fact, it was the Vatican that helped open up Cuba with Obama a little later on.
You write about that in the book, right?
Exactly. So maintaining a strong relationship with the Vatican means you have an extra set of ears and eyes to draw on, and historically that relationship in America has been up and down. And I would say certainly in the Trump administration it suffered, and now I think with former Senator Joe Donnelly there as our ambassador, we've got another interlocutor there. And that's what allies should do, is their diplomats should talk to each other about mutual problems they see in other parts of the world. We help strengthen that, I think, because we had a great relationship with the new Pope.
I want to get to questions from the audience, but step back for a second, and you get the question, and I get the question from time to time. Well, religion and politics, they really shouldn't combine. We should keep, the state and the church ought to be separate. There shouldn't be all of this intermingling of religious faith into policymaking, into government. So how do you respond to that? How do you, when people say that, what do you say?
Well, we heard that almost every week. The first thing I would say is that there was an army of lawyers in the White House and an army of lawyers in the State Department who said it's not illegal for an American diplomat to talk to the Pope. Now, our Constitution does disestablish religion. If we get to the point where suddenly somebody says, the church of what's happening now is the official U.S. church, I think, in that sense, I do believe in separation. The United States should not have an officially sanctioned church. But in terms of diplomacy, so I don't want to do the domestic scene because we could talk about that for hours, but diplomatically, internationally, if diplomacy is about trying to persuade people to follow better policy and to agree for a more peaceful world, to ignore religion and religiously motivated actors makes no sense whatsoever. If you want to understand what's going on in a country like Ukraine, you need to understand religion. Now, in some places, I will grant you, religion is not necessarily a driving political force. So you have to sort of go country by country to say, what are the religious dynamics here, and are there opportunities for American diplomats to have fruitful conversations that lead to mutual benefit. We then had to find those spots around the world where mutual conversation might lead to stronger foreign policy. So we weren't everywhere in the world. Now, having said that, one of my major professors said this kind of work with the U.S. government engaging diplomatic around the world, he said it's like brain surgery. It may be necessary, but done wrong, it could be fatal. So there is a sobering piece of this, that these kinds, and I think we've seen that in the Trump era, where religion was not a source of analysis or understanding. It was a source of partnerships that could yield a domestic political advantage. And so certainly there are cautionary tales here. But we were radically inclusive. I never asked anybody, who did you vote for, or what's your party registration? It was, can we find a place where we can work together for progress around the world? And as I say in the book, an extraordinary range of people from the political left to the political right came and talked to us. And there were very, very few times when I refused to meet with somebody from a particular group. You have to read the book to see that list. That's all I'll say. But I think we were known as being fair. I think we were known as being, and I had conversations with people that for 4 years never went anywhere, but I kept trying. So that was kind of our approach.
This will be my last question, and I want to invite your questions. Look ahead a little bit. We have got, issues play out all the time. We have a Supreme Court in which these questions of religion and faith, intersect with a lot of things that are contemporary and issues that we deal with as a country. We've got on the eve of a presidential election, which is hard to predict what will happen, even who the candidates will be, but clearly there will be a way in which religious communities, faith communities, whether it's evangelicals on the Republican right or maybe more progressive clergy on the progressive left, will play some role. How do you see this playing out? Are we going to enter into a period in which spirituality and faith becomes more important in our politics, or are we going to pull back from that because there's kind of a adverse reaction to that sometimes in the body politic? Where are we headed, I guess, is the question.
Well, let the record show that my ability to predict the future has really been lousy to this point. I think in the short run, it's going to get louder. It's going to become more conflictual. I think in this town, I've been here for 23 years, the impulse to be bipartisan and to maintain relationships has probably never been lower. You may have a different view, but it's hard. It's really hard. Yeah. And I don't see any indicators that's going to change. I do think when you see religion intertwined with the insurrection 2 years ago, and those dynamics now where people are going to prison, that is not going to shut down the level of conflict. Now, I think there are dynamics in the evangelical world where the number of white evangelicals is shrinking, but the ones who are involved in politics are highly motivated to vote, so their impact is going to remain, I think, quite strong. I think with the racial trauma we're experiencing now multiple times a day, I know religious leaders in the African American community are not going to be silenced. If anything, the existential threat is higher than it's been, I don't know since when, but certainly in a long time. Those leaders are going to be speaking out and more actively involved. What I fear as a former diplomat is how that spills over and erases any kind of the old notion that partisanship stops at the water's edge. I think with the religious freedom complex becoming in some circles more vociferous, and Islamophobia, and with the rise of anti-Semitism, those global dynamics are getting worse. I think in the short run, at least, it's going to be very, very hard. And religious communities are not always going to be on the cutting edge of reconciliation, whatever that means. So I think it's going to be quite conflicted. Now, having said that, I think there are going to be more voices in the Republican Party going after white Christian nationalists. I don't think on the left, the Biden administration has not shown a lot of interest in actually getting down in the weeds and building relationships with centrist and progressive groups. I don't think they're going to get over the reticence that's currently in the White House.
You know, I lied. I said that was my last question. I have another question that prompts. You know, we are dealing with this disaffiliation of people with organized religion, attendance going down, churches losing property and closing, and, the affiliation with organized religion going down, especially among young people. Right. Have you thought about that? I mean, have you thought about is there a reason to arrest that decline, or what could be done? What could be done to make the church more relevant so that people actually want to participate? I'm curious. I'm just asking you out of the clear blue.
Well, it is a generational shift. Our children, for instance, their generation is not affiliating institutionally. But ironically, and social scientists are sort of all over this, not always to our benefit, the rate of agnosticism and atheism among that generation is not exploding. So what's happening is that there are different forms of religiosity or spirituality evolving and appearing, and the pollsters and social scientists are still chasing down what that means. So it doesn't mean necessarily joining the local Methodist church, but those people aren't becoming hardcore sort of Richard Dawkins atheist acolytes. And the social scientists have trouble following those people, and so they know, you hear the refrain oftentimes, spiritual but not religious. And that's often code for, I no longer go to my parents' church for varieties of reasons. So if you're in the business of training clergy, if you're in the business of helping in houses of worship of whatever flavor grow, there's no silver bullet. I think this is a generational thing. Now, what's interesting is, what do you look at immigrant religious communities? I was in Des Moines, Iowa as part of my travels, and there were like 5 different Buddhist organizations there. Des Moines, Iowa, for goodness sake. I had no idea. It was stunning to see. So how does immigrant and refugee religion evolve as well? Muslim church or Muslim mosques are growing in America. Are they experiencing the same disaffiliation experience that their Christian and Jewish congregations are? I think they are. And what's the response going to be there? All I know is the prognosticators are probably going to be wrong. And whatever the answer is, it's going to be much more complicated. because this is not the first time in American history we've seen this kind of disaffiliation from organized religion. And so if there's one message from the past, it is whatever we think the next iteration is going to be, we're probably wrong and it's going to be different.
Not to plug the bookstore, Brad, but if you look right down here, religion general is the subject on this aisle here, and there are books aplenty that people are writing and thinking and talking about many of these issues, and I think they are going to stay with us and they are going to be a part of our national conversation. But our conversation continues now with any of you who want to have some questions. Yeah, go ahead.
We have a microphone. I think
Yes,
if you come up, they'll catch you on the
We're
record.
We're zooming, and so you're live and international.
So I have a question, and you touched on this a little bit, and it is about sort of white Christian nationalists, not domestically but internationally. And the State Department has a few tools it can use. Obviously, it doesn't have the power of the purse, but it seems like when it came to labeling, one of the tools is designation, right? Designating them as terrorist groups, which puts in all sorts of restrictions. And when it came to Islamic groups, we were pretty quick to label different Islamic groups, but we really haven't used it except for one white nationalist movement, RIM. And I'm just wondering why you think there's this hesitation to go after what is becoming a real problem around the world, because these groups are finding each other and ultimately finding groups in the U.S., and they're really hard to stop.
Yeah, that would take another book. But I will say in the book I talk at great length about how people tried to draft us into the countering violent extremism movement, and we resisted. I think that was problematic in the Obama administration, and there were better ways to get at that. And we, as a friend of mine says, CVE, countering violent extremism, is a theory-rich, data-poor enterprise. And we had enough brain power and analytical power in the so-called Islamic world to know that sort of hammered approach was not right. I think that's nested in the larger issue of the rise of right-wing populism around the world. It's an epidemic. And the only thing I can generalize about that is, A, there's often, on the part of the authoritarian leadership, a favored religious group, and there's often a disfavored religious group. And often, historically, the favorite target is Judaism on the part of authoritarians. Now, there are 1,000 caveats that go with that, but there's certainly the spike of that is one of the most troubling things. And it's going to take a rethink, because my fear is the government will always approach it from a purely security, badges and bullets approach. And that's not how you win hearts and minds in the political world, as far as I can see. Great question, fairly lousy answer on my part.
Thank you.
I was curious, during the Clinton administration, there was an ambassador for at large for international religious liberty, Bob Seipel, and I was wondering how that office interacted or not with your office.
So that office still exists. There are advantages.
That's a very complicated story.
That's a complicated story. But I will tell you, they were authorized by an act of Congress. So in many ways, their hands are bound in terms of what their mission is and what they're able to do. The ambassador at large for international religious freedom, and we have a good one, Ambassador Rashad Hussain today, has to generate this massive annual report where we say in country X, there were so many episodes where different religions were persecuted, and in country Y, the same, and here are the trends. And this puppy is now over 1,000 pages. Now, I'm here to say I don't think many people have ever actually read it from cover to cover for every year. And once they release that report, the ambassador has a very large diplomatic backpack with a few tiny pebbles in it. And he or she can go around the country and throw the pebbles after the report comes out saying, Mr. Ambassador or Mr. Prime Minister, you need to do better. And that's about all they've got in their tool. Now, there can be economic consequences, tariffs and things like that, embargoes. But in terms of face-to-face diplomacy, you can't have one ambassador visiting 200 different countries and engaging them to turn the heat down on the persecuted religions. Our mandate was not from an act of Congress. As long as the Secretary would agree that we should pursue a line of effort, we were able to do it. So we could be much more nimble, much more responsive, but religious freedom was not our bailiwick. That's not what we did. So we can talk at great length. I think that religious freedom space needs to be reformed and redone. The legislation authorizing it is 25 years old. The world has changed, and the problem has morphed in some different directions.
Let me ask you, has that question of religious freedom been thrown into the maw pit of polarization and some of the political divisions that we see? Because that's certainly what I feel.
Oh, there's no doubt. And it was particularly troublesome in the Trump era because you had the president imposing a Muslim ban, which on the face of it seems like an attack on religious freedom. And at the same time, we know from John Bolton's book, the former national security advisor, that President Trump told Chinese President Xi Jinping, do build your concentration camps for Uyghurs. Now, if you're the ambassador for religious freedom and you know these two things are true, you've got a very hard job.
I didn't mean to be overly political there, but that was a good point to reference.
So it is susceptible to being manipulated for partisan purpose. In some cases, it has been.
Congratulations on the book. I know that you mentioned in the presentation that many of the diplomats you worked with were sort of skeptical or sheepish about addressing religious questions, but it also seems to me that American foreign policy from the founding of the Republic to the present moment is saturated in religion. I know it wasn't the mandate of your office to look within, but I'm curious about your thoughts when you do that about American foreign policy and its many religious overtones, good and bad.
Well, your point's well taken. One of the first diplomatic engagements Thomas Jefferson had as Secretary of State was dealing with the Barbary pirates who were stealing and boarding American ships in that part of the world. And essentially, I think today we would say paying tariffs in order to leave American ships alone. There might be another vocabulary to use. So throughout American history, our diplomacy has engaged with religion in various formations. And so it's not a question, should we do it or do we do it or do we not do it, but do we do it poorly or do we do it better? And that was one of my senior staffers kept saying to me, our job is not to introduce American diplomacy to engaging religious actors. It's to try and make it better and make it more explicit and more sophisticated. And I agree with that. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question about Iraq. So let's suppose that it's a given that the U.S. is going to invade Iraq. It's a given that it does. What difference would it have made if the administration had a better understanding of religious differences and commitments in Iraq?
That's a great question. I have an entire chapter early in the book, which I call the $7 trillion hedgehog. I mean, actually, the number went up during the course of the printing. The amount of money we will have spent on Afghanistan and Iraq by 2030 will be $8 trillion. That's a big, big number. And most of that paid by going into debt. My argument is, in the lead up, if you look at the publicly available memos and the autobiographies and memoirs of people who were involved in the decision, religion was put out of the discussion. So our foreign policy apparatus did not function in making the decision to go to the war. The president made that decision himself. So the question was not even really asked with any sophistication. The Sunni Shia thing, what is that about? What might await us and await our troops if we invade? My argument is if the right analysts had been within earshot of the president and taken seriously, we would have known how we invaded was not going to be successful. And it cascades then to the insurgency, which pops up, You look at the post-conflict reconstruction efforts. You look at the attempt to write the Constitution for Iraq, and then you look at the counterinsurgency strategy that General Petraeus wrote in, 2007, 2008. The religious assumptions were always either ignored or they were wrong because they didn't turn to the experts. So after we invaded, that was too late. If you had brought in the religious analysts, I don't think you could have pulled the plane out of a dive at that point. But had you done the thorough vetting of what awaited us at the end of that invasion before we invaded, I think there would have been a compelling case not to go to war. And you can see the argument as I lay it out there. And to me, that's the primary example for those of us who are taxpayers and just regular citizens, that if we don't get religion right in these huge cases, we will bear the consequences literally for generations. I'll say just in closing, I've had two people with military, either family or family, who have read that chapter on Iraq, who served in Iraq, and they say, yes, you got it right. We didn't understand what was going on at the lived religion level there, and we paid the huge price for it.
The book is well worth buying for many reasons, but that chapter in particular. I will just give that plug. I think we got time we have one more here.
Hi, my name's Jane. I'm from New Orleans, and I teach world religions down there in New Orleans at a Catholic university and Tulane University. But I have two questions. One question is, your office no longer exists inside the State Department, in which I think it should. So, but can you talk to what is the difference? I know the difference, but the White House faith-based office run by Melissa Rogers, that's still in existence. How is that so different than, and why is that still there but you are not in the State Department?
Well, I can't answer the second one, but I will say Melissa was my partner because she did the same job in the second Obama term. Melissa had one staffer and like one administrative assistant. Okay, you can't do global religion with a staff of 35. That's laughable. And if that's laughable, doing it with 2.5 or whatever she had, that really was not her bailiwick. It was primarily domestically focused. Now, there were some issues like the papal visit and other things where she was deeply involved. But you do have the National Security Council in the White House itself. So you've got, and depending on who you talk to, there are 400, 500, 600 people on that. And right now, you don't have a lot of religious expertise, nor have you really ever had a lot of religious capacity on any National Security Council. It's just not seen as a priority.
We'll have you as the last question.
Right. You know, I am a Palestinian Christian, and I've been observing the Middle East, all my life. And but I tend to think, I appreciate your book, enjoy what you're saying. When I look at Sykes-Picot, the architecture of the Middle East, the colonial powers knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew the Christians here, the Druze here, the Kurds here, and they, sliced and diced knowingly. And then, during the 50s, with Nasser emerging and the Arab nationalist movement emerging, we invoked religion, saying, he's an atheist, he's not God-fearing, and you guys have to be on our side, et cetera, et cetera. But the question I have for you in terms of Syria, where I know Kerry missed, I thought, which is, the Alawites, minority of all minorities. And they put together a composition of minorities to rule, including Syrian Christians and Armenians and, Druze, everyone. And I remember Kerry saying, we're going to get him, and we're going to get him out, and he's going to be out. And they didn't realize that Assad had over 50% support from the indigenous population because he was a secular women. When women were free, they weren't being subjugated. And all the minorities, the Christians, I'm a Christian, were behind him. So somehow you guys missed that. I just want to see what you think about it.
Well, yeah, we could spend months talking about Syria, and I'm not a Syria expert. I will just simply say I mean, I had a professor who used to talk about North Korea as the land of no good options. And I think Syria may trump North Korea now as the sort of headliner in that category. The religious dynamics there, to the extent I understand them, are just overwhelming. They're so complicated. There's no easy answer, and I don't think there's a diplomatic solution that's imminent there. I do think the Obama administration, which was heavily criticized, in my estimation, wisely decided not to send troops there, because I think it would have made Iraq and Afghanistan look like a picnic in comparison to. But that is going to be a highly unsatisfying answer to a Syrian Christian, and I apologize for that, but I don't see any easy answers there.
Before I close, because we've run out of time here, I just want to take a moment for all of us here to thank Bradley Graham and his wife, Lissa Muscatine, for doing what they do to offer this place for all of us to have conversations like this. So thank you. And the other thing I'll do is put in a plug I should have done earlier. Dr. Casey has also written another very interesting book called The Making of a Catholic President, which was when? In
1960.
Well,
Kennedy v. Nixon.
Kennedy v. Nixon, but the book came out
2009.
2009, so it might be floating around somewhere in here. But it is, looking at this question of how religion and politics intersect, which is something that I think is a very, very important topic, is something that he has spent a lot of time doing. So I give a plug for that. And thank you. Thank Bradley for all this, and thank all of you for being part of the conversation.
And thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
Copies of